Welcome to the State of Hope Live. We're so happy to have people joining us from all over the world. My name is Hazami Barmada, and I'm the founder of the Humanity Lab Foundation, an advocacy and social impact organization committed to unlocking human potential and democratizing change. And I'm also so proud to be the executive producer and host of the Finding Humanity podcast, in which we've been so lucky and honored to have produced a special series with the elders, many of whom are with us today. Hopefully, over the past week, you've had a chance to listen to some thought leadership and insights that have been shared by the elders on the state of hope. Where are we as a global community, and where do we need to go to revive a sense of normalcy, dignity, and justice for all? So today, we're going to unpack some of these issues with some of the people who've been at the forefront of not only driving change, but for advocating for more empathetic, passionate, and compassionate leadership around the world. In 2007, Nelson Mandela founded the Elders with a mission of engaging with local leaders in civil society at all levels to resolve conflict and to address its root causes, to challenge injustice, and to promote ethical leadership and good governance. We're going to explore these very issues today as we consider how Mandela's vision remains so important in tackling some of the world's largest, most intractable challenges that we're facing today. When founding the Elders, Nelson Mandela said, and I quote, "I am certain that they will support courage where there is fear, foster agreement where there is conflict, and inspire hope where there is despair." And of course, he was talking about the members of the Elders, many of whom are with us today. So without further ado, I am so honored and proud to introduce my esteemed discussants for this conversation. We'll start with Mary Robinson. Mary is chair of the Elders and is a former president of Ireland. We have President Juan Manuel Santos, who's the former president of Colombia. Hina Jilani, who's a pioneering human rights lawyer, and Zeid Raad Al Hussein, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. We recall together Mandela's legacy and consider, in such pressing and dire times, where do we draw a sense of hope? And how do we find a way forward? We'll unpack these and more. And throughout the live event today, we'll also share some of the results of the polls that many of you engaged in over the course of your registration to this event. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to Mary and to President Santos in my first question. And I'm going to ask, what is the importance of Mandela to the Elders and to you personally? Over to you, Mary.
Well, Sami, I think I'll begin with me personally, if I may, because I had the honor of being present at the inauguration of President Mandela in 1994. And then 2 years later, in 1996, I paid a state visit to South Africa, both formal occasions, but I also saw the teasing and the humor and the humanity and the compassion and the wonderful leadership. And I realized that Nelson Mandela was the most extraordinary man I had ever met. So he also helped me when I was High Commissioner for Human Rights. I remember wanting to know, where could I help to launch the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and with whom? With whom was obvious, and the where became South Africa. Nelson Mandela, as president, helped me to launch the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration as he launched South Africa's Plan of Action for Human Rights. Very memorable times. So in 2007, in early 2007, when I was approached by Richard Branson and Jean Alwang coming to my office in New York, I was a bit skeptical about this idea of elders. I mean, come on, elders for the whole world. And then we met for a planning meeting in Ulasaba, which is a place that Richard has in South Africa. And, it was an incredible meeting. Jimmy Carter was there. Grassa, of course, was there. Tutu was going to be our chair. Muhammad Yunus was there because he was with us in the early days as an elder. And Kofi Annan joined us at that stage by screen. He was with us for the formal launch, but he joined us by screen on that occasion. And when Nelson Mandela, Madiba came in, we heard the singing, and he sat at the table with us, and he told us to be humble. He told us to listen. And I realized this was an incredibly important responsibility, a mandate. For the rest of my life, I had to work to try to further the legacy of this extraordinary man who had such a sense of forgiveness, who had so many lessons for our world then, and even more so, I would say, now. So for both me personally and for the elders, I believe that Mandela is key. Indeed, I don't think we would have the moral force as elders. We couldn't purport to be elders in the way that we do if it wasn't for his legacy. We're not elders for ourselves. We're not elders in the abstract. We're elders for the legacy of this extraordinary man who has so much to teach us about how we must live together in our complex world.
President Santos.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's an honor to be here with you. Mandela is simply an inspiration for the elders. As Mary has just said, his words, his thoughts are the words and thoughts that inspire us all in our daily work. What we do is exactly what Mandela told us to do. And I think this is of great importance for the elders. Personally, Mandela has had a great influence in personal life. 25 years ago, I went to Johannesburg to give him the chair of the 8th conference of the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development. And that morning, I turned on the television, the South African television, and I saw something which really impressed me. In real life, the victims and the perpetrators of the South African conflict were meeting for the first time. And some of them embraced each other, others screamed at each other. It was a surreal scenario. That afternoon, I went and asked Mandela, what was that? And he said, you need to bring together the victims and the perpetrators to heal the wounds of a war that has been going on for so long. And we sat down to discuss the war and the need for peace. Well, 2 weeks ago, 25 years after, in Colombia, we did exactly the same. In television, for the first time, the victims of our own war, of our conflict, and the perpetrators came together under the supervision of the Truth Commission. And it was a very, very emotional and I think healing for the Colombian society. And the conversation that I had with Mandela about peace and about the principles and values that have to guide a peace process were all taken into account in the Colombian peace process. So personally, for me, Mandela has been of great importance, a guidance, and I only have words of appreciation for what he has done in general, but for me in particular.
And that's really powerful. I mean, you both speak about the importance of not only personal experience, but also the interpersonal dynamics and our humanity, which is so often, unfortunately, left out of our politics and our policies. Nelson Mandela said, and I quote, "I believe that in the end, it is the kindness and generous accommodation that are catalysts for real change," end quote. We're going to go to you, Zeid. What is the importance of Mandela's legacy for tackling the challenges that we face today?
Well, thank you, Hazami. It's almost now a daily occurrence. You hear the word influencer. And it, of course, refers to people who have influence over markets, commercial sort of influence. Unfortunately, it also sort of cheapens the word of influence, those of influence. And in a more traditional sense, that word would be ascribed to people who exhibit moral behavior at a standard which is appealing for everyone. When you look at Mandela, he stands apart. I mean, very clearly apart, demonstrated through example of sacrifice, as was noted earlier, example of forgiveness, of kindness, of ultimately of greatness. And in today's world, where you have global leadership, which is essentially morally poverty-stricken, with very sort of limited foresight, very limited sort of capacity for embracing people of every color, of every ethnicity, of every creed, and seeing humans for what they are. It all sort of brings home that the legacy of Mandela is still very relevant, very alive, and sadly, in one way, it just shows, given climate change and the pandemic, the absence of other Mandelas, I mean, just demonstrates the void that exists. And perhaps he was so unique that we won't see someone like him too often. I think as elders, we try and fill the gap, knowing very clearly that there's an enormous difference between us because we have not sacrificed 20 years or 27 years of our lives to advance a particular cause, which is what he did, and he was able to forgive. No, a remarkable human being, a giant of his times and of our times too.
Well, and Mary, I want to go to you because you often speak of being a prisoner of hope and this idea that we need to invest into more ethical leadership in the world that we live in today. To Zeid's point, we do have a moral dilemma when it comes to lack of ethical leadership in a lot of the spaces where there's a lot of concern. And we'll bring that up in the questions that we got from our audience and also through our polling, where, people are concerned about these issues. So looking at Mandela's legacy and looking at catalyzing real change, why and how do we carry forth this legacy and tackle the challenges that we have today through nurturing this idea of kindness and empathetic leadership?
I think it's really important to remember those that really mattered to Nelson Mandela: children, women, those on the margins. He saw his role when he became president as one of absolute service to his people and more globally to good leadership and good governance in the world. I often think about moral leadership myself. I found when I was a non-executive president, unlike President Mandela and other presidents in the world, like Juan Manuel and others, I had to find a way of a kind of moral leadership. When I became High Commissioner, as Zeid followed me, we had to have a leadership that is no big stick. And all through that, Nelson Mandela's example was so clear. Not just kindness, but I would also add humor. He was such a tease. I could tell you many instances where I just burst out laughing at his comic timing and his teasing. Why? Because he actually wanted to diffuse the idea that he was somehow on a pedestal and above people. No, he wanted to be, he wanted to make people laugh, because making them laugh was sharing that fun. And of course, Archbishop Tutu, even more so. It was Archbishop Tutu who gave me that wonderful phrase, being a prisoner of hope. And why is it so important? Because if you have hope, then you see maybe the glass isn't half full. There may only be a tiny bit in the bottom, but work with that, build with that, move forward with that, and do it bringing people with you, not rushing ahead or asserting yourself in a personality first way. No, listening and giving that kind of leadership that is inclusive, that is thoughtful, that knows that there are people on the margins who have particular problems, reaching them. That's what Nelson Mandela was trying to tell the elders. This is the leadership I want from you as part of my legacy.
And Mary, you actually really hit on the head a lot of what the audience that's participating actually had to say. So in advance of this event, we asked a selection of our audience members to give us an idea of what gives them hope for the future. And the top of that poll was compassionate and ethical leadership. But what does this mean in practice? And how do we turn compassion into ethical action? And I think there is oftentimes this disconnect where we talk about hope, and some people find it to be just fluffy and lofty and not actionable. So back over to you, Mary, to further build on that. How do we translate compassion into action?
I think we should see leadership basically as being service. It is service to the people you lead. So if you are a head of state or a prime minister, you need to put first, how can I do this on behalf of my people? How can I ensure they have the services they need, that they have the, that I bring my people out of poverty as quickly as possible, if that's the challenge. And, you know, it's absolutely a kind of the opposite of a lot of the leadership that we see in our world, the kind of populism, the nationalism for myself, and, you know, in a narrow sense, the sense that leaders have to be surrounded by such pomp and circumstance. I've never really understood that. I don't know why we have to give leaders such, you know, pomp and aloofness and august. No, it should actually be a matter of service. When Nelson Mandela was president, he was never somebody who surrounded himself with pomp and circumstance. On the contrary, he made himself as accessible as he could. He served one term because he wanted to promote a democracy of a vibrant sort in his country. And then he gave himself to so many causes, Burundi and other places that needed peace building in our world. So, you know, the example is so relevant today because far too many leaders are leading for their own selfish and their coterie around them, their selfish needs, not for those who need most good leadership, who are those who are most marginalized, you know, those who are perhaps migrants in a country, those who are the poorest, those who are LGBTI, you know, sexual orientation, and maybe under particular pressure. It's that compassion, that ethical leadership that really matters, and it was what Nelson Mandela taught us.
That's fantastic. And you know, as we're talking about leadership in civil society and leadership in, again, where a lot of the world is starting to think about where do we go from here, Hina, how do you think Nelson Mandela's legacy really impacts also how civil society needs to be not only better engaged, but more active in ethical decision-making and leadership? What are your thoughts on the intersection of Nelson Mandela's legacy and civil society engagement and the role of average people around the world in impacting change?
You know, Mandela brought the elders together to amplify the voices that are raised for freedom, social justice, equality, peace, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Today, all these values are under threat of erosion globally. It is therefore important for us as elders and as human rights campaigners, collectively, individually, to raise our voice and the civil society intends to do that. We want to take forward Mandela's legacy and his efforts to bridge global divisions, deflate trends of intolerance, hatred, and xenophobia, and give a voice to the needs of the most vulnerable. As the elders, we are committed to overcoming injustice and to propagate approaches towards people-centered decision-making at all levels, local levels, national, and global.
Well, unfortunately, Hina, you're breaking up a little bit due to the realities of the beautiful world which we're living, which is internet is not always as reliable as we'd love it to be. So just confirming that we have you back with us, Hina. Well, we'll try to hear back from you shortly, and we'll come back and hear that, because that's a really important point on the role of civil society, and really, making sure that civil society is not just window dressing. And I think a lot of communities often feel tokenized by engagement, and what you're referring to and talking about is really making sure that they're substantively engaged in the agenda itself. So without further ado, I'm going to go over and to our poll. And in the process of setting this event up, we asked you some questions. And one of the questions was, what is the biggest challenge facing humanity today? So I think we have the graphic for that, if we can get that up on our screen. So as you see here, these are based on the inputs of people that are watching, all of you all. So here we go. Climate change, 43% of you said that climate change was the biggest issue that we are facing today. 7% armed conflict. 2% nuclear weapons. Injustice and inequality is 40%, so tied up there with climate change, and then pandemics and global health. So as we're looking at these poll results, I would like to ask Zeid, what is your perspective on what we see on our screen today when it comes to where are the priorities of people, and when we're looking at the biggest challenges that are facing humanity?
Well, the priorities of people are to live a dignified life. Clearly, the world needs a regulator. The regulator is the multilateral system anchored by institutions like the UN. And the regulator is weak. But the regulator is weak because the governments across the world make it weak. I mean, you have to think of it in the context of a football match. The individual football players, let's say in the Premier League in the UK, are far more powerful than the referee. They get into their Bentleys and Rolls Royces at the end of the game. They go back to their palatial, dwellings, mansions. The referee will often take, the underground or take a bus home. But on the pitch, on the field of play, the referee decides, because the rules decide. And the players, in effect, have given this power to the referee, who's arguably, again, the weakest of all the participants. On the global stage, the governments have created a system where essentially they are cheating, they are violating, they don't listen to the referee. Indeed, they don't give enough power to the referee, i.e., for instance, the Secretary General of the UN. The Secretary General of the UN has to be able to issue yellow cards, red cards, hold leading political figures who are populist, nativist, who are violating the rights of their people to account. But it's incumbent on the most powerful of the players, the captains of the teams, so to speak, to give that power to the referee. And the referee has to be willing to issue the card. If we don't have that sort of scenario, we don't have a football match. There's no fairness. There's cheating, you're left disgusted, and that's essentially what we have on the global stage as well. People are just fed up.
And Zeid, what you're saying?
The global governance is weak, and the rules are being broken. And so if you want to lead a dignified life, you have to aspire for better leadership. People need to vote, people need to participate, get out there, make your views known, find the agency within yourself, but also, as Mary was saying, find Nelson Mandela's humor, because if you have too much agency, it can quickly become narcissism, and it becomes an extremism of its own. And so the humor is a modulating effect on passion, a modulating effect on reason, and leaves everything in perspective. And a sort of a healthy dose of humility is always good, as Mandela taught us.
And Zeid, you bring up some really important points around the role of dignity. And we see climate change ranked so high. And ironically, well, it's not so ironic, actually, most of the people who are most severely impacted by climate change are those who have no access to decision-making and to actually influence the global agenda. So there's the irony of those who are often facing the most injustice in our world are the people who have the least amount of access to change their own reality. And that in and of itself fundamentally is a critical issue. But Mary, I want to go over to you, and then President Santos will come to you. But Mary, we see nuclear and it is so low. And we did a podcast episode on this not too long ago around why is there not more outrage around the existential threat of the looming nuclear threat that we're facing in the world today. Why do you think that this is not on the forefront of people's minds? And we also see, for example, conflict is not that highly ranked, yet so much of the world right now is riddled with conflict. Mary, what are your thoughts on this?
I think the poll is quite understandable. Actually, it's a poll where injustice and inequality and climate change should be actually put together because climate change is bringing about so many injustices. The injustice to the poorest countries who are most affected but least responsible, the gender injustice, the intergenerational injustice, the injustice of the fact that industrialized countries built their fossil fuel and now have to wean themselves off with just transition. But developing countries need access to clean energy and they're not getting the investment and the solidarity. And then the injustice to nature. All of those are aggravating that sense that people have of inequality and injustice. So I understand the bulk of the poll would reflect that. But I am aware that we are not sounding an alarm sufficiently. And it's a difficult thing because you don't want to just make people fearful, though there is reason to be fearful. The doomsday clock is at 100 seconds to midnight. We need to wake up. And what we need to do is to move perceptions of things. There are huge defense budgets and they're growing all the time. And a lot of it is renewing now nuclear weapons. That's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. It's against the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We should be reducing and getting into that mindset of being able to live increasingly without, and then ultimately without nuclear weapons. They must never be used. And that was the commitment that was made. And it's terrible to see the kind of disconnect between the amount of money spent on refurbishing nuclear as a so-called policy of somehow preventing nuclear war. It's not. It's actually leading to the inevitability of a mistake of a regional conflict, which could well be what triggers it, or even now they're beginning to have nuclear weapons that they say are potentially usable. All of the approach is wrong, and we need to get a broad constituency to really understand this. And the elders, taking our cue from Nelson Mandela, have a strong policy on this issue.
And I want to talk to also the conflict element of this. President Santos, we've talked about it on the podcast, and you've talked about the need, and going back to Nelson Mandela's legacy, the need for compassionate, ethical, and you often use the word empathy and empathetic engagement when you're talking about issues that might be hard, right? Peacemaking, peace building are hard. And so how would you react to people's thoughts on the biggest issues that we're facing today? And more so, if you could focus a little bit on this idea of empathy and understanding the other as it relates to that part of the poll where people said armed conflict is one of the biggest issues facing our world today.
Well, first of all, I would like to agree with Mary when she says that the two most important points in the poll, climate change and inequality, should be together. And she herself wrote a book about this concept of climate justice. And I think this is crucial to understand the challenges of the world today and tomorrow. We need to address this in a holistic way. With respect to conflict and empathy, it's extremely important in order to build trust, which is fundamental in the workings of any institution and in the world in general, and the relationship between people in particular. In order to build that trust, you must be able to hear the people who think differently. And empathy is putting yourself in the shoes of the people who think differently. And we need to promote empathy at all levels. And that will certainly reduce conflict. We have had conflict throughout history precisely because we consider the people who think differently as our enemies, and we have to destroy them. Well, that's wrong. And that's why the legacy of Mandela in that respect of considering their adversaries as adversaries, not as enemies. What he did with the people who mistreated him is a great example of what we have to do in today's world.
And that bridges to a question that we actually got from our audience in advance of the State of Hope talks. And Zeid, I'm going to put this one to you. And I quote from one of our attendees is, how can we hasten the populist swing back away from nativist politics to multilateral cooperation on social and economic issues? We are seeing nationalism on the rise. We are seeing multilateralism, maybe to some arguably on the decline. How can we make sense of this, Zeid?
Well, it's nothing really that unusual in the human experience. You know, we've experienced this before 100 years ago, in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century. There are sort of faint, it's a sort of there's an image or an impression of the past that is playing out itself in the present. You know, many of the populists are third-rate politicians who have sought a device, and the device is you basically elect a particular item over which you can generate considerable fear. The fear and anxieties may already exist in populations. And then you find a target, usually an immigrant population, an ethnic group, a religious group, and you hurl the vitriol against that group and lay blame for all society's ills there. The UN and multilateralism was set up as the riposte to nationalistic, chauvinistic nationalism. It was the idea that we would work collectively to solve the world's problems, and without assuming that each or any country is morally superior to any other country. The idea was we lived and inhabited on borrowed time, if you will, if we didn't work together. Now, this is fraying, and of course it is alarming. And as I said earlier, it's like a soccer match or a football match where the referee is given hardly any power, and the players are violating the rules on the field, and the game is no longer fair. And the spectators see this and are disgusted. And it's the same thing. If you want to have a multilateral system that works, the strong players, the captains, let's say the permanent members of the Security Council, have to give that power to the referee, right? The head of the UN or the head of any international organization. And then they have to play the part of a regulator to ensure that international law is being observed, international human rights law is being observed, international humanitarian law is being observed. At the moment, the referee is too weak and the players are too strong. And that's why we have what we have. And that's what explains the pandemic. It explains climate change. It explains conflict. It explains everything that we have. Basically, there are some rules, but they're being broken too often. And there's no regulator that's powerful enough at the moment to do the job. And that's what we need. And that's what has to change.
And Zeid, I want to push a little bit further into this, because on our Finding Humanity podcast, we covered UN, specifically the UN Security Council reform, and why we're not making action towards that. The system being set up, in a post-World War II reality 75 years ago, and hasn't adapted much, yet the dynamics of the world have shifted so much since then. Can you further drill into where can we find hope in that reform process to make the outcomes of the Security Council and the very issues you talked about, to really harness multilateralism and move away from this idea of this populist nationalism? How do we start to find hope in inching towards there? How do we do the very thing that you're talking about right now?
Well, the hope comes from originality of thought. all too often there's an orthodoxy of thought. There's a rail that guides most people's thinking, and we all sort of seem to parrot the same thing. As soon as someone does something slightly more original, they begin to capture the imagination. And if it's based on principle and based on law, that creativity then goes a very long way. We only have to see Greta Thunberg, a 15-year-old Swedish student, and look where she's brought her generation. It's quite amazing. So hope emerges from the various corners of human experience where originality exists. And in the Security Council, there are members who are thinking originally. And the elders had the privilege of briefing and with Mary's leadership, members of the Security Council recently, and we could discern there was some thinking that was beginning to probe in these areas. I think there's a realization that continuing on the current path is not going to bring us to any better place, and therefore originality and thought based on principle gives hope, and it can come from unusual quarters. But we need to think in ways that are unorthodox, and perhaps, to be a bit philosophical, we need to use different language. And we're all trapped in a very narrow lexicon of language. In the international sphere, it's sort of probably 20,000 words, and it sort of traps us in thought. We need to expand our thinking a little bit further. And we need more than ever to look deep into the divergent historical narratives, because that is ultimately the sort of poison that allows for overreaction in political life, and overreaction then spills over into something else. And so I think an attitude that exposes what needs to be exposed helps a great deal.
Mary, I do want to follow up with you on that. I know I referenced, several episodes that we've done on the podcast where you really talk about the importance of multilateralism and why the status quo that Zeid's talking about needs to change. You talked about how climate change and inequality, are married together. And we're seeing this with a lot of things, COVID-19 and what happened. Majority of the people that were impacted, we saw COVID has exacerbated those inequalities. And we're going to talk about COVID in just a moment. But as we're looking at multilateralism and to somewhat maybe seeming like failing or weakened multilateralism is, I think, the frame that we use most often. What is your thought on how do we start to restore this sense of the importance of cooperation and collaboration to achieve solutions on many of these issues that are impacting majority of the world?
I think we need to appreciate fully that the kind of problems we have cannot be solved nationally. They are bigger, whether it's the impacts now of climate shocks, the climate crisis, whether it's a virus that turns the whole world upside down. We need an equitable approach to vaccines, etc. Otherwise, we'll get variants that will hit more, like the Delta variant now is hitting countries that thought they were ahead on vaccination, and suddenly it's come back again. So, we have to see that the problems are such that we need that multilateral cooperation. We need to reinvigorate it in a way that broadens it. We need, and it is happening a little bit, broad coalitions. If you take the way we've marked the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Conference against, for women, we postponed it for a year, and then we had this Generation Equality Forum in 2 countries, in Mexico with an awful lot of young people taking part, and in Paris with more official voices. But in each case, the coalitions were very broad. They were action coalitions. I chaired or moderated the Action Coalition in Paris on a feminist approach to climate justice. I can't tell you how excited I was. This is new thinking. This is great stuff. I really liked it. I felt excited. If we can recharge multilateralism, it's in the interests of the biggest countries and the tiny countries, the small island states. It's in the interest of all countries. The elders have a strong policy paper on this, and we're very, very clear on it. But somehow we need to not be set in our ways on it. It's a vibrant broadening of coalitions that are helped by the internet, helped by the fact that you can build. It involves corporations, it involves the trade unions, it involves civil society, it involves women's movement, children, young people, climate activists. migrants speaking for themselves, refugees speaking for themselves. We're much more now aware that we need the voice of those affected at the table to move forward. And all of this is part of recharging multilateralism in a forward-looking way.
Mm-hmm. And I want to go over to another poll question that we received from our audience. And so the poll question asked, what is the biggest challenge facing the COVID-19 recovery? And, you know, some countries are now talking about being in a post-COVID reality. And as someone mentioned earlier on this live event, there are a lot of countries that are now facing the grappling, not just facing, but grappling with the realities of COVID and what that has done to their societies. So we asked people, what are the biggest challenges facing our recovery? And here's what you all had to say. 8% said it was economic. 27%, which is a lot of what we are talking about today, is lack of trust in world leaders. And 28%, lack of multilateral coordination, vaccine inequality, and I would add even inequity to that, and then inadequate health systems in the pandemic. And so as we're looking at this, President Santos, what is your feedback and your reflection and response to what our audience felt were the biggest challenges in a post, or not even a post, but in COVID-19 recovery?
Well, I think they are correct. And again, many of the points that were asked in the polls should be merged, should come together. And I would define the biggest challenge as a lack of leadership. Lack of leadership is what has caused this weakening of the multilateralism, and lack of leadership within the countries has brought about the populism, nationalism, and many of the problems that we have. So how do we regain that leadership, the trust in public leaders and public institutions? And that brings us again to that very important word, empathy and compassion. Because through empathy and compassion, and I think Mandela is a great example, you build confidence of the people in your leaders and in your institutions. And that's what we need today. Cooperation is something that this pandemic showed that is absolutely necessary. There's a mantra that is saying we will not be safe until everybody's safe. And that is applicable to many of the problems we have in the world. Nobody will be safe until everybody is safe. Nobody will be better off until everybody is better off. And this is a great challenge of the post-pandemic world, to build new types of leadership. And fortunately, they are emerging. We are seeing them, that will bring back this trust in the leaders and the institutions, that will facilitate the strengthening of multilateralism and the decisions that are necessary to, as they say today, build back better. For example, in the distribution of the resources, there's a word that is very important: a just distribution of the resources in the world and within the countries. And that has to be done with compassion, thinking about the weakest echelons of the society. And if we do that, we will build back much better.
And if I may, Hazami, just building on what Juan Manuel was saying, in 2015, we got a huge framework for all of this. The 2030 Agenda with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I still wear this badge. Where is it? It's on this side. It was agreed that we would leave no one behind, that we would tackle hunger and poverty and inequality, and those goals are embraced by civil society, by women's movements, by business in a number of cases, around the world, and countries, and philanthropy. So, it's a form of cooperation that came out of the multilateral system that we must reinvigorate again, because it's been set back by COVID. Girls' education has been set back. So many issues, and countries are having less fiscal capacity to recover in a green way, the way they want to, because they don't have the resources. And so we need a global equity post-COVID that we're not seeing yet, but is going to be crucial to countries to being able to move forward on this agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Could I also jump in?
Absolutely, Zeid. Absolutely.
No, the problem we have is that we like to build foundations and build the walls, but we never complete it by putting the roof on. So we have all these initiatives that we begin, that governments are enthusiastic about, but the hard work of finishing is never seemingly something we can do. We have countless resolutions that have never been implemented properly. We have initiatives, for instance, the Aichi targets on biodiversity, 22 targets set in 2011, only 6 partially met, none fully met. The SDGs, as Mary was saying, have captured the imagination of many around the world, from school children to civil society environmentalists, human rights activists, and the movement generally. But governments themselves don't seem to be able to complete the job. We still don't have, in the system, we still don't have one representative in a country in the global north that anchors the SDGs. It's as if the SDGs are still for the global south, because governments in the global north won't accept what's called the resident coordinator. So, people become frustrated because there's a genuine desire to see the SDGs brought into full effect. But for the reasons Juan Manuel has said, global leadership is lacking. It's all short-term. It's short-term gains. It's marketing superficialities, as Mary was saying, pomp and circumstance. It's all sort of, if you can get the right spin out and you have the right publicist, then you can make things happen at the polls. But long-term, deeper change, it requires really good leadership. And if the elders can inspire through Nelson Mandela's example, the sorts of leaders that we would need politically, then of course there's a market there, because the youth of this world, those who are deprived, are desperately in search of that sort of leadership, politically speaking.
And you both bring up something really important, and you bring up a really important point, Zeid, when it comes to accountability. And the interesting thing about the system around the SDGs is really reframing it from the global goals to the people's goals, because the reality is the SDG framework also needs accountability at all levels, including the engagement of citizens, not only thinking about things like socially conscious consumerism, but also being better advocates, knowing how to advocate what we choose to be outraged by. I like the frame "good trouble," that came out of the United States. But this idea that we need to also understand the very systems that we're trying to change. And yes, the SDGs are a framework, but at least they bring us all together around this shared vision of what needs to happen. And now the missing step, to your point, Zeid, is now how do we make it happen? How do we hold people accountable? But then also, how do we unlock the potential of majority of the world's population that doesn't have a seat at the table, that doesn't have access to resources, that cannot drive that change? And on that point, I want to go to you, Mary, with a question from our audience, which is, what is the concrete and replicable call to action for an ordinary citizen? What can I do? Asks one of our viewers today. Mary.
Well, the way I answer that shows that I'm very immersed, as Juan Manuel has said, in climate justice. And that really does touch a lot of the issues that we're talking about. And I think everybody should take 3 steps that are crucial. And the first step is to make the climate crisis, because it is really a crisis. Now, governments haven't really understood that yet, that they need to be more in crisis mode. But we need to be in crisis mode. Take it personally. What does that mean? It means you recycle more carefully, or you use your electricity or your energy more efficiently, or you vary your diet, as so many people are beginning to do. Secondly, Get angry with those who have more responsibility, with governments, with corporations, with cities, with investment. This is a crisis. Get into crisis mode, tell them. Join organizations that are trying to advocate, or use your voice and your vote. Just as a citizen, be responsible as much as you can for trying to get those more responsible to do more. And the third thing is the most important. You have to imagine this world that we need to be hurrying towards, because that's the key. We need to want to get there really badly. And I don't think we're psychologically quite there yet. It's going to be a so much healthier world. We won't have the fumes of fossil fuel, the indoor cooking on coal and charcoal and animal dung and wood that so many women cook on and die from indoor smoke inhalation, and their children around them also are affected. Also the outdoor, the vehicle fumes in cities, the number of deaths. The air is so much cleaner. In the early days of COVID, we all noticed that we could hear the birds singing, we could see without that fog of fumes. So that's the world we're hurrying towards, but it'll also be a much fairer world, because it has to be, because the developing world has to get the clean energy and the clean jobs and the entrepreneurship that will let them also be part of that future that we're talking about. And so, I'm kind of the view that this is something now we all have to take responsibility for and keep remembering over and over. It's a crisis. And in a crisis, you don't carry on as usual. You change, you transform. And governments need pushing to do that. So we all have to push. I use a bad thing, push like hell.
But in order to push like hell, there's one key element. You have to empower people. And if we want a solution to the problems of the world, if we want the SDGs to be fulfilled, we need to empower the people. That is absolutely fundamental.
Mm-hmm. And I like to think of not just empowering people, but I like to think of this idea of partnership and shared value, which we don't hear about often, because every single industry is siloed in its own space, where you have CSR doing something, and then you have corporations doing something, then you have individuals and nonprofits doing something, and advocacy doing something. And it would be really beautiful to imagine, Mary, to your point, a world where we're actually creating shared value, where we understand how every single one of us is part of this larger ecosystem, and the activities and the actions and decisions that are made by the global north impact the global south, or in my community, impact my neighbor. And it starts with one. It starts with all of us coming together. And I want to dive into hope, because we are gathered here today in an event called the State of Hope. And Nelson Mandela's legacy is so much anchored in not just hope, but using hope as a vehicle for action. So I want to ask you all, and we'll start with you, Zeid. What gives you hope in the world that we're living in today, with all the issues that we have going on?
Well, a cynical response is that we are not prophets. We always, I think, as a human species, have anticipated the worst, and I'm pleasantly surprised that we're still around. We're still making progress. We have seen enormous developments when it comes to the human rights of women, children, marginalized groups. We still have a long way to go, of course. But we've been sort of thinking about the oblivion of the human species for now well over 70 years. When we entered the nuclear age, we worry about biological weapons, but we're still around. We're fairly persistent. And we should have enough brain power to overcome these conditions, which are, after all, are created by human negligence or stupidity. And hopefully the sum of people's wisdom and the sum of people's goodwill can sort of overcome what it is that we're being threatened by. And so you won't be able to live if one wasn't hopeful. At least live a normal existence without sitting on a therapist's bench all day long. And so, and in the smaller sort of experiences, the daily experiences of, you see strangers helping others, doing small acts of kindness, and it always fills us with hope. And when you travel around the world and you see marginalized communities that can still smile and can still laugh, and you think even in their most terrible conditions, they find happiness, and that's what we should celebrate. And as Mandela, through his example, if you can come out of 7 years of imprisonment with hardly a shred of bitterness and humor, well, I mean, what an example for all of us.
And you're absolutely right, Zeid. The power and the resilience of the human spirit in some of the most marginalized and just, unjust places in the world is beyond inspiring. President Santos, what gives you hope?
I'm a natural optimist, and I read history and I see the world with optimism. And I think that this pandemic is opening up new great opportunities to have a better world. It's making us more conscious of where is it that we need to work and what are the changes that we need to do. And I think that we can really reach the objectives that we are dreaming of, because history has taught us that this is possible. I remember when we started discussing how do we replace the Millennium Goals with something like the SDGs, and most of the countries and most of the people said, no, that's impossible. Well, it was possible. When we thought about making peace in my country after 50 years of war, they told me, don't try, all your predecessors have failed. We did it. Who would have thought that today in Chile, an indigenous woman is presiding the Constitutional Assembly that is changing the Constitution of Chile? That was impossible just a year ago. So I am a natural optimist. I think that we always need this hope. In Spanish, it's a beautiful word. It's called esperanza. And we have to nurture that hope every day in order to have a better world. And we are going to have a better world.
And Mary, you are a passionate believer in hope, and I have witnessed this in my numerous conversations with you over the course of our podcast. What gives you hope?
Well, I want to build on what both Zeid and Juan Manuel said, and I'm really sorry that because of internet problems that we couldn't hear Hina earlier on so many of these things, because she's so human rights, fundamental on justice issues, etc., and her words would have been very valuable. But I actually have a particular reason to hope now, and it's what young people are doing and saying. What they're doing is they're connecting our world. They're getting out of silos. They're talking about the intersectionality of the issues that we confront. It's a long word. It's a feminist idea. And it really means the deeper links. So there are links between Black Lives Matter, the Me Too campaign, the Fridays for Future, all of these. And I think we're now seeing a willingness, more so than I've ever seen in civil society, to link across. And this can be an enormous empowering bottom-up of where we need to go. I mean, I saw in the Paris Climate Agreement that it was the small island states and the indigenous peoples who insisted on getting 1.5 degrees into the text to say we have to work at 1.5 degrees. And when the scientists studied it, that became the goal. That's now what everybody talks about, staying at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial standards. We wouldn't have had that, but for the small island states, and at least if we can get civil society taking on the energy and the intersectional mindset of these young climate activists and children who are striking from school with their Fridays for Future, they are global citizens. They actually read the world now, and they read the science, and they want us to have this integrated approach going forward. And they're impatient with us because we're not dealing with it as a crisis, and they know it's a crisis. And I feel great hope from that energy. I really wanted to grow and grow all around the world.
Well, and I want to quote, I think it's fitting in the closing to quote Nelson Mandela, and he says, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And these conversations contribute to getting us to a place where we start thinking about what do we do to get there? Where do we have to go? What do we have to deconstruct? And where can we find hope and laughter, as you both mentioned, Zeid and Mary, in this entire process to keep going when things just seem so unattainable? And Nelson Mandela, as we gather here today, we're celebrating his legacy on also his birthday. And he was the exemplification of an ethical leader, someone who really talked to compassion and forgiveness and generosity. But what's the most important thing, I think, to take away from this is the understanding that every single one of us should and has a moral obligation to step into our own power, our own potential, and our own ability to drive that very change, because change happens and transformation happens in our communities, in our schools, in our homes, in our institutions, and really in speaking truth to power, in collaborating, in partnership, and in co-creation of change. And so I'm so happy and thankful to have been able to join you all for this past hour and to hear the fantastic and really important, not only advocacy that you are each doing, but that the elders is doing holistically. And we invite all of our audience to please check out the State of Hope website, where you'll be able to listen and hear from some of the thought leadership pieces of the very people that we've had with us today, and also see some of the feedback and other public engagement around the State of Hope. Where do we go as a society? What's next? And I also would love you to encourage you to look at the Elders' social media accounts, where we're also going to be releasing on Sunday a podcast episode with Graça Michelle, the co-founder of the Elders, and Mary, my beautiful co-host, on the State of Hope, on Nelson Mandela's legacy and the State of Hope, and where do we go from here? And I want to leave you with a final message that not only is knowledge power, but you, every single one of you, not only have the power to be the change, but you are the change simply by showing up every single day against all odds and not losing hope. Please do make sure to stay in touch with us. Check out the State of Hope Live and follow us on social media. Thank you so much, and blessings be with you all.